I am Dr. Márcio Pereira, a neuroscientist, and I dedicate my work to studying how the human brain constructs emotions, bonds, and behavioral patterns that we rarely consciously perceive. Today, I want to talk about something that seems simple at first glance, but which hides one of the deepest conflicts of the human mind. Why do you repeat the same mistakes even knowing the outcome? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. People often say they make mistakes because they are impulsive, because the heart speaks louder, because they believe too much, trusted too much, insisted where they shouldn't have. The socially accepted explanation is almost always moral or emotional: lack of willpower, naivete, neediness, excessive attachment. And when someone repeats a destructive pattern, the common reaction is to judge them as someone who doesn't learn from their own experience. But this explanation is superficial. It ignores something fundamental. The human brain was not designed to seek happiness, balance, or even coherence. It was shaped over thousands of years to ensure emotional survival and predictability, even if it comes at the cost of suffering. When you repeat a mistake, what's at stake isn't a lack of knowledge about the outcome. Most of the time, you know exactly how it ends. You've lived through it before. You've felt the same frustration, the same disappointment, the same emptiness. Yet, something inside you pushes you in the same direction, not out of ignorance, but out of recognition. The human brain doesn't seek what is good, it seeks what is familiar. Repetition activates familiar, predictable circuits that require less cognitive energy to process. Even when the experience is painful, it carries a strange kind of security. The brain knows what to expect, knows how to react, knows how to suffer. The unknown, on the other hand, demands adaptation, risk, reconstruction of identity, and this, for the nervous system, is profoundly threatening. That's why so many people find themselves trapped in the same types of relationships, the same professional conflicts, the same self-sabotaging choices. Not because they desire suffering, but because the brain associates familiarity with survival. The known is interpreted as safe, even if it is toxic. From a neurological standpoint, this pattern is sustained by ancient circuits linked to dopamine and the reward system. Dopamine is not associated with pleasure itself, but with anticipation. It is activated when the brain believes that something significant is about to happen. And, ironically, the brain can learn to anticipate even pain, as long as it comes with a known emotional promise: acceptance, belonging, validation, momentary relief. Thus, the mistake becomes a cycle. You anticipate it, get involved, suffer, get frustrated, promise not to repeat it, and sometime later, you feel the urge again to return to the same point. Not because you forgot the ending, but because the brain is seeking the sensation that precedes the impact, the hope, the possibility, the illusion that this time it will be different. Society silently reinforces this mechanism. We are taught to believe that persistence is a virtue, that giving up is weakness, that fighting to the end is a sign of character. Little is said about the psychological cost of repeating stories that the body already knows how they end. Little is taught about the difference between conscious perseverance and emotional compulsion. And so a sophisticated trap is formed. The individual believes they are making choices, when in reality they are obeying old patterns, shaped by early experiences, unresolved emotional bonds, and emotional needs that were never named. They feel free, but they react. They believe they are deciding, but they repeat. What's most unsettling is that the more times the cycle repeats itself, the stronger it becomes. The brain learns, reinforces, consolidates. The mistake ceases to be an accident and becomes a script, a silent script, operating below consciousness, guiding decisions, attracting the same types of people, recreating the same dynamics. And then comes the question that almost no one wants to face, because it dismantles the narrative of control that we have built over ourselves. If you already know exactly how this story ends, why does something inside you keep insisting on starting it again? When we observe someone repeating the same mistake over the years, the tendency is to imagine that they lack learning. But what neuroscience reveals is almost the opposite. The brain learns very well, perhaps even too well. It learns emotional patterns, registers responses, consolidates associations, and begins to operate them automatically without asking permission from consciousness. The correct question, therefore, is not why you make the same mistake again, but why your brain considers this mistake consistent with who you are. From childhood, the nervous system constructs internal maps of the world and of itself. These maps are not rational, they are emotional. They are formed from early experiences of attachment, rejection, care, absence, instability, or predictability. The brain learns very early on what to expect from people, and more importantly, what to expect from itself within a relationship. If, for example, affection came mixed with tension, unpredictability, or fear, the brain begins to associate love with anxiety. If recognition came only after extreme effort, the system learns that suffering is necessary to deserve it. If abandonment was recurrent, the mind begins to interpret loss as something inevitable, almost natural. These associations don't disappear over time. They deepen. In adulthood, individuals believe they are making free choices, but in reality, they are being drawn to scenarios that activate these old maps. The brain recognizes the pattern and releases familiar chemical signals: dopamine in anticipation, cortisol in uncertainty, adrenaline in emotional threat. All of this creates a paradoxical feeling of intensity, which is often mistaken for passion, purpose, or destiny. This is where one of the biggest modern misconceptions arises: the idea that what provokes intense emotion is necessarily true or meaningful. The brain, however, does not distinguish between depth and familiarity. It only responds to what it already knows. Therefore, what is calm seems boring. What is stable seems dull. What is predictable seems empty. But what hurts, yet is familiar, generates emotional engagement. It generates inner movement. It generates the feeling of being alive. And so, without realizing it, the individual begins to reject healthy opportunities because they don't activate the same chemical circuit. They don't awaken the same urgency. They don't produce the same emotional peak. The brain interprets this lack of intensity as a lack of connection, when, in fact, it may be exactly the opposite: security. There is also a deeper factor, rarely discussed: emotional identity. Throughout life, a person constructs a narrative about who they are. This narrative includes their failures, their suffering, their disappointments. In many cases, suffering ceases to be just an experience and becomes part of the self. Changing the pattern would therefore require more than willpower. It would require abandoning a known identity. It would require giving up the story the person tells about themselves. And this generates a real psychological threat, because the brain interprets the loss of identity as an existential risk. Therefore, even in the face of pain, the system chooses what it already knows. It prefers continuity to emptiness. It prefers familiar error to the silence of the unknown. It prefers repetition to reconstruction. Society, in turn, reinforces this cycle by romanticizing blind persistence, confusing love with sacrifice, and treating suffering as proof of emotional depth. Little is said about the silent courage to break patterns. Little is taught about the neurological difficulty of making choices that don't activate old circuits. And then, without realizing it, the person begins to live an entire life trying to solve the present with emotional tools from the past. They repeat, insist, return, forgive, adapt, not because they truly believe it will work, but because the brain doesn't yet know how to operate in any other way. The question that is beginning to form now is more uncomfortable than the previous one. If your brain repeats the mistake because it wants to keep your identity intact, who do you think you would cease to be if you finally stopped repeating it? There is a point, rarely discussed, where human behavior ceases to be a choice and becomes an automatic reaction of the nervous system. It is at this point that the conflict between consciousness and survival becomes most evident and most disturbing. The human brain has layers. The oldest layers, responsible for survival, operate quickly, instinctively, almost blindly. They assess risks, detect threats, and seek predictability. The more recent areas, linked to reflection, analysis, and decision-making, are also involved. Conscious decisions are slow, deliberate, and energetically costly. When there is conflict between these two layers, the older one almost always wins. This means that even when you rationally understand that you are repeating a mistake, your body may be reacting as if it were protecting itself. The attachment to familiar patterns is not just emotional, it's physiological. The nervous system learns, over time, what kind of pain is tolerable. It adapts to it. It creates defenses. It adjusts expectations. But when faced with the unknown, it goes into a state of alert. The heart races, breathing changes, the body prepares to flee or fight, and the brain interprets this state as danger, even when there is no real threat. That's why change hurts in a different way. It's not the pain of familiar failure, but the anguish of emptiness. The silence where there was once conflict. The absence of stimulation where there was once chaos. For many, this is unbearable. There is an even deeper element. The brain constantly tries to confirm its own predictions. It functions like a biased scientist, seeking proof that its beliefs are correct. If, on some level, you believe you will be abandoned, sabotaged, or disappointed, your internal system will unconsciously move toward situations that confirm that expectation. Not out of masochism, but out of internal consistency. This dynamic creates a vicious cycle. The mind anticipates the outcome, behavior adjusts to that expectation, and the final result confirms exactly what was feared. The brain then registers, "I was right," and the pattern is reinforced. We call this an emotional self-fulfilling prophecy. What's most unsettling is that the more times the cycle repeats, the harder it becomes to interrupt it. The neural connections become more efficient. The path becomes shorter. The response, more automatic. There comes a point where the person doesn't even realize they're choosing. They just follow. It is at this stage that many describe the feeling of being trapped within themselves. They know something needs to change, but they can't sustain the change. They feel guilt, frustration, shame. They promise to do things differently. But when the old emotional trigger appears, the body reacts before consciousness has time to intervene. And here emerges one of the hardest truths to accept. Understanding the pattern is not enough to transform it. Understanding is only the first step. The brain does not reorganize itself through logic, but through repeated emotional experience. It needs to experience the new several times before accepting it as safe. Until that happens, he will continue pulling the individual back to what is known, even if it means suffering. Perhaps that's why so many people say they want to change, but secretly fear what lies on the other side of change. Because change doesn't just mean abandoning oneself. Mistake. It means facing the void it leaves behind. It means living without the script that, for years, gave meaning to one's own pain. And then the question becomes even more uncomfortable. If you stopped repeating that pattern today, who would you be tomorrow without the story you've always told yourself? There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when the pattern ceases to be merely a behavior and becomes intertwined with one's own identity. It is no longer something the person does. It is something they are, or believe themselves to be. And it is precisely at this point that the repetition becomes most difficult to break. Over time, the brain not only learns the path, it comes to recognize itself in it. Experiences accumulate, failures are repeated, internal narratives solidify. I'm always like this. This always happens to me. In the end, everything ends the same way. These phrases are not just thoughts. They are cognitive structures that shape perception, expectation, and behavior. The brain then filters reality based on them. Anything that confirms the pattern is highlighted. Anything that threatens to dismantle it is minimized, ignored, or sabotaged. The individual begins to reject, almost automatically, experiences that could break the cycle because they conflict with the story he has constructed about himself. There is a profound psychological cost to change. Change requires abandoning not only habits, but entire versions of who you believe yourself to be. It requires questioning memories, redefining meanings, revising past decisions, and, to the brain, this sounds like a loss of identity, a symbolic form of death. That's why so many people remain trapped in relationships, careers, or behaviors that hurt them. Not because they don't see the pain, but because they don't know who they would be without it. Suffering, however cruel, provides a narrative. It gives shape. It gives meaning. It gives continuity. Emptiness, on the other hand, is unpredictable. and the brain fears the unpredictable more than it fears known pain. There is also a social factor that is rarely discussed. We live in a culture that reinforces dysfunctional patterns while disguising them as virtue. Persistence is exalted, exhaustion is romanticized, excessive dedication is mistaken for love, constant sacrifice is treated as proof of worth. In this scenario, breaking cycles doesn't seem like maturity. It seems like failure. Thus, the individual learns to endure the unbearable, to normalize what corrodes them, to call what has been repeating itself for years a phase. They learn to rationalize their own suffering, to find plausible explanations for remaining where they are. But the body doesn't lie. Even when the mind tries to justify it, the nervous system registers the wear and tear. Anxiety accumulates, emotional exhaustion sets in, the feeling of emptiness deepens. The body begins to signal what the conscious mind avoids facing. And then comes the most delicate moment of all, the moment when the person realizes that the pattern is not external. It's not in the circumstances, nor in the people, nor in chance. It's in the way they learn to relate to the world and to themselves. This realization doesn't bring immediate relief. On the contrary, it generates discomfort, fear, and resistance. Because from that point on, it's no longer possible to pretend that everything is bad luck, fate, or coincidence. A silent responsibility arises to choose differently. But choosing differently isn't simple. It means tolerating the emptiness, remaining in silence where there was once conflict, enduring the absence of stimulation where there was once drama, learning to recognize security without confusing it with boredom, relearning to feel without seeking chaos as proof of intensity. And perhaps the hardest part is accepting that the brain by itself will not drive this change. It will continue trying to preserve what it knows. Transformation requires something beyond automatic impulse. It requires presence, observation, a rare kind of quiet courage. Because ultimately, the repetition of mistakes doesn't happen due to a lack of awareness of the end, but due to fear of what lies beyond it. And the question that remains without an immediate answer is the most unsettling of all. If you stop today from repeating what you've always done, could you bear to live without the identity you built around your own pain?